Entry complete. Like, comment, subscribe. The archive remembers.
I did my mandatory service back in the Soviet days in Moscow in one of the ministry buildings. By now, everyone knows that the basements in places like that are huge and deep, just massive underground facilities. We called them basements. The one where I served was enormous. You didn't even go down there by elevator, but by an escalator like in the metro. Entry, of course, required passes with double security. By the end of the workday, only the duty shifts stayed. The protective doors were sealed shut, doors strong enough to withstand a nuclear blast. After that, no one could enter or leave the basement without the duty officer knowing. My post was a lucky one. When the workday ended, only me and my second number stayed on duty. The post was positioned in such a way that nobody could sneak up on us, so in the evenings, we calmly did our own things. Glued album pages, sorted paperwork, drank tea, worked out a bit, that kind of stuff. That evening, everything was the same. Everyone left, we did what we were supposed to do, heated up some tea. It was a Friday evening. A normal captain took the basement duty, someone who didn't give the shifts a hard time, and everyone hoped for a relaxed Saturday. Then suddenly Major Rokotov appeared. He called from the lower level and told them to bring him up. With the engineer officers in the basement, everything was different compared to the platoon. They didn't care much about formal regulations. You did your job. Good, no one bothered you. You could chat with them about life, ask them something. Rokotov was a good boss. He didn't nitpick without reason. Sure, he had a couple quirks, but who doesn't? And he really was an engineer from God. That's true. I'd like to tell a couple of stories about him, but I simply can't. Anyway, the major came up. I see he's in his work overalls, all dirty, tired, and annoyed. We gave him tea and asked what happened. The major said that a mechanism at the far node had broken down. The mechanism wasn't complicated, but two of my fellow conscripts couldn't fix the malfunction. So the major himself, the head of the section, went to see what was going on. But even he, after almost 2 hours, couldn't figure out why the mechanism didn't work. That's why he returned late, tired and annoyed. That mechanism was only an auxiliary device, used rarely, so there was no urgent need to repair it. The major drank his tea, brightened up a bit, changed clothes, and went home. I walked him to the exit of the basement myself. Then me and my second guy went back to our usual routine. About an hour and a half later, the duty officer's assistant suddenly called and asked whether Major Rokotov had left. I was surprised and said he'd left almost 2 hours earlier. The assistant grunted and hung up. At the time, I didn't think anything of that call. A few minutes later, the assistant called again, asking once more if I was sure Rokotov had left the site. I tensed up a bit, but again confirmed that I had personally walked the major all the way to the exit. The assistant was a warrant officer I knew, so I asked what was going on. He said that someone had called from the far node, introduced himself as Major Rokotov, asked them to restore power to the far node, and then hung up. The far node wasn't answering calls from the control room or over the internal comms. In the control room, they can see exactly where a call is coming from, so a mistake is impossible. And the far node is called far for a reason. It's more than a kilometer away, nobody would go there casually. Especially no one had any reason to call from there and pretend to be Major Rokotov. On top of that, the passage leading to the far node was sealed after the workday by a massive hermetic gate that couldn't be opened without the duty officer's authorization. The control room was puzzled, but they restored power to the far node anyway. Who knows, maybe the major was busy and didn't feel like reaching for the main comm line. Though technically, it was a serious violation of every rule. Another half hour later, the control room tried calling the far node again. No answer. They decided the major had finished whatever he was doing and left. For some reason, they didn't remember the closed hermetic gate. The assistant then called me, and only from me did he find out that Rokotov had gone home long ago. The control room didn't bother to sort out the time discrepancy, probably decided I had mixed something up. And since the major had supposedly left, the duty officer ordered the power switched off at the far node. When that happens, the lighting and machinery shut down, only emergency power remains. Almost immediately after power was cut, someone from the far node called again. The voice said it was Rokotov, asked them to restore power again, hung up, and stopped answering further calls. That was when the assistant phoned me the second time. Again, I confirmed that I had personally seen the major leave. The assistant said nothing and hung up. I couldn't understand a damn thing. In total, the basement had 2 more entrances, but one wasn't for regular personnel at all and was almost never opened. The second one was closed at that time. And you couldn't get into the basement without the duty officer knowing, even if the major somehow wanted to return. I had buddies in the guard company, so I called them at the pass office. They told me Major Rokotov's pass had been turned in. That meant there was absolutely no way he could be in the basement. They also said the control room had called them literally a minute earlier asking the same question about the pass. That really messed with my head, and I started trying to figure out what all this could mean. There were, in theory, 2 ways to reach the far node. The kilometer-long passage ended with another huge hermetic gate, but even the control room couldn't open that one without special authorization. And the far node also had an exit from another basement of ours. The simplest explanation would have been that someone from that basement went out, used the phone at the far node, called the control room, and pretended to be Major Rokotov. That would have explained everything. But first, the exit from that basement was sealed with a hermetic door under alarm. Second, that exit was directly in view of the duty officer at that basement. Even if someone tried to jam the sensors and open the door, he wouldn't be able to do it unnoticed. And third, this wasn't some rundown office. Nobody in their right mind would mess around with the control room like that. Then the duty officer himself called. Like I said, he was a normal guy who talked to conscripts easily. In his usual rough, joking way, he asked me what the hell was going on with the far node and with Rokotov. I said I had no clue what was happening and didn't understand what they wanted from me. The duty officer said that if this was supposed to be a joke, he acknowledged it, but enough was enough. I told him again I had no idea what he meant, that my second number and I had seen Rokotov leave the site more than 2 hours ago, and I didn't know who was calling from the far node. Honestly, I even started suspecting the control room was pranking me. The captain loved to joke, but not while on shift. Then the captain said that the far node had just called again, Major Rokotov supposedly, and demanded they send me to him, and that I bring the repair kit and the feeler gauges from his desk. That completely knocked me off balance. I said that was impossible because I had called the pass office myself and I knew his pass was already turned in. The captain went silent for a moment, then asked if I thought he and his assistant had lost their minds. Oh, and I forgot to say, Rokotov had a very distinctive way of speaking, and even over the phone it was hard to confuse him with anyone. As for the pass, well, it was technically possible that at the end of the workday when people were leaving in crowds, Rokotov might have slipped back into the basement even after turning his pass in. The guards knew him by face or could have simply missed him. I told the duty officer this was obviously someone from the other basement pulling a prank, but the captain said that after the second call he'd asked the duty officer there to check if anyone was at the far node, and they confirmed nobody was there. The captain said he didn't want to embarrass himself in front of another division, and told me to take the repair kit and the gauges and go to the far node to see what was going on. Actually, I had every right to refuse by the manual. I wasn't allowed to leave my post. But like I said, that captain and I had really good relations. We'd helped each other out plenty of times. So, still kinda stunned, I grabbed the repair kit, the probes, and headed to the far node. Yeah, I forgot to say, the Renkoplect is just a bag with wrenches, screwdrivers, and other small crap. And the probes were even funnier. A probe set is like a Swiss knife, except instead of blades it has metal plates of different thicknesses, used to set the gaps correctly. That set was buried in a pile of papers in Rokotov's desk, and if the duty guy hadn't told me where it was, I'd never have found it in my life. Anyway, I grabbed a flashlight too and trudged off to the far node. I had to pass through the KDP, and there the duty officer and his assistant stopped me. They asked if I'd noticed anything strange in Rokotov's behavior. I said I hadn't noticed anything except that he looked unusually tired. Again, I said that I was sure the calls from the far node were someone's stupid prank, because I honestly was completely convinced of it, and I really didn't feel like dragging myself all the way out there. But the duty officer said I had to go. Well, fine, so I went. In general, when you're young, you don't take these weird things all that seriously. But while I was walking toward the far node, I suddenly started feeling uneasy. Don't know why. I should say that underground I usually felt completely at ease. I wasn't afraid of dark tunnels. I liked being alone on night shifts when nobody was around. In the army that doesn't happen often, and you really value a moment to be alone. But this time some kind of anxiety got to me. I even jogged part of the way, even though it was a pain to run with that heavy bag of tools banging against me. The corridor leading to the far node ended with a vertical shaft about 20 meters high. There used to be an elevator there, but later they removed it, and the only way up was by stairs. Instead of the elevator, they'd installed a hoist, which they sometimes used to lower or lift cargo through the old elevator shaft. I climbed the stairs and noticed the barrier around the shaft was open. That was unusual. It only happened if they were about to lower something into the shaft. The Major wasn't in sight. From there, the corridor continued another 50 meters or so and made a sharp turn to the right, so I figured Rokotov must be somewhere further ahead. Suddenly, I felt really uncomfortable. Not scared exactly, just uneasy. I couldn't stand it and shouted for the Major, loudly. No answer. I peeked into the room where the mechanism was installed. Nobody there either, but the light was on. The cabinet was open and the circuit partially disassembled. I switched off the light and stepped out, closed the shaft barrier and went on. The phone I was supposed to use to call the KDP was almost at the very end of the Hodok. But there was no one there either. That's when I really did get scared. I don't know why. I remember thinking it was some kind of setup from the duty officer, but the captain was a normal guy, and this wasn't the place for jokes. Out of fear, I switched on my flashlight, even though the lighting was more than enough. I remembered the open shaft barrier and got scared that the Major might have fallen down by accident. I went back to the shaft and shined the light down, but the shaft was empty. I shouted for the Major at the top of my lungs several times, but nobody answered. I went back to the phone, called the duty officer, and told him there was no one at the far node. The captain stayed silent for a while, then asked where Rokotov had gone. I said I couldn't possibly know. The captain asked if I was absolutely sure I didn't meet him on the way. I swore I hadn't seen the Major since he changed and left toward the exit. The duty officer cursed and ordered me to return. I hung up and headed toward the stairs. And suddenly, ahead of me, I heard the shaft barrier creak. When you open it, it makes this very specific sound, and the mesh rattles in a way you can't mistake for anything else. For some reason, I instantly calmed down. That meant my Major had been found. I turned the corner and really did see the Major. The shaft barrier was open, and the Major was standing right at the edge with his back to me. The lighting was bright enough, and from about 30 meters away, I couldn't have mistaken him. I yelled to him, excited. The Major heard me and turned around while still standing at the very edge of the shaft. He was still in his aparativka, and I even briefly wondered when he had time to change again. I could see his face clearly. I even saw how he smiled when he noticed me. Nothing in his appearance or behavior seemed off. I completely relaxed and slowed down. Then the Major suddenly raised his hands over his head. Slow, like someone told him to command hands up, and slowly started tipping backward. It took me a second to even realize what was happening. He looked straight at me, calmly smiling, and slowly fell backward. I screamed and ran toward him, but I didn't make it in time. Right in front of my eyes, Major Rokotov fell into the open shaft. I didn't reach the shaft. It was like I got hit with paralysis. For a few moments, I genuinely couldn't move, and I could hear the Major falling down with no scream at all, scraping against the shaft guardwork. Then I heard a thud from below. I ran down the stairs. The height wasn't that big after all. The Major could have slowed his fall grabbing the metal lattice of the shaft and survived. Normally I should have reported the emergency first and called for help, but that didn't even cross my mind at the time. My brain basically shut off, and I was doing everything on autopilot. I ran down the stairs. While I was messing with the pretty stiff latch and opening the lower doors into the shaft, I thought my heart was going to jump out of my chest. I opened them, and there was no one there. Right then, it felt like my mind just snapped. This strange feeling washed over me, like it was all a dream or happening to someone else. I looked up, in case the Major had managed to grab onto something after all. The shaft guardwork was made from regular channel beams and chain link mesh. There wasn't much light inside the shaft, but enough to see clearly that the Major hadn't grabbed onto anything and that the shaft was empty. At first, I was insanely relieved. If there was nobody in the shaft, that meant Rokotov hadn't fallen and wasn't smashed at the bottom. But where did he go then? I saw him with my own eyes falling. I heard him falling and heard the mesh rattling. I started shouting for the Major at the top of my lungs, not choosing my words at all. Now I think it was already hysteria. I was shaking and my voice kept breaking, but no one answered. Complete silence, only the hum of the lamps and the blood pounding in my temples. That's when I got truly scared. Not the fear I felt when I saw the Major fall into the shaft. Something completely different. I don't know how to describe it. A kind of fear that isn't in your head but somewhere in your gut, your spine. Just one thought, run. I've never run like that in my life. I only stopped when I reached There it was. Bright, people around, I loosened up a bit, caught my breath, and slowly started to think. But what was there to think about? If I went to the KDP, what would I even tell the duty officer? You can't just say you watched the major fall into the shaft and then evaporate. But the thought of going back and checking everything again made my skin crawl. And if I said I hadn't seen anything, that was scary too. What if something really did happen to the major and he needed help? How I didn't lose my mind right then, I still don't understand. In the end, I decided to go to the duty officer and say that the lights at the far node had gone out and everything needed another look, and that he should send someone else. I made it to the KDP. I was shaking all over, my legs barely holding me. The duty officer and his assistant stared at me, eyes wide. I must have looked like hell. They asked what happened, but my throat seized up and I couldn't push out a single word. Everything I'd planned to say just vanished, and all I could see was the major falling into the shaft. I managed to croak out only one word, Rokotov, and couldn't say anything else. The assistant, Praporshik, smirked and said everything was fine with Rokotov. Turns out that after my call from the far node, they dialed the major's home number, and Rokotov himself answered. He'd already been home for a long time, and was very surprised by their call. He confirmed that earlier that day he had indeed gone to check the mechanism at the far node. The malfunction turned out to be something tricky, and he couldn't fix it before the end of the workday, planned to finish tomorrow. Then, I completely stopped understanding anything. What the hell had I seen at the far node? Or had I just gone crazy? The duty officer and his assistant, seeing me like that, realized something was really wrong and started pressing me with questions, and I didn't know what to answer. And then I made the mistake of asking who the hell was calling from the far node if the major had been home the whole time. I look over, the captain got kinda gloomy and said they'd deal with those pranksters later. And the Praporshik suddenly called me by name and asked what happened to me at the far node, why I was all ruffled, why I had no piladka, and where the Remkoplekt was. Only then did I notice I really was without my piladka in the bag, just standing there with the flashlight still on, clenched in my hand, and I had no idea what to say. If I told them I saw the major fall into the shaft, they'd boot me off the shift instantly, and I didn't have much time left to serve. The captain must have picked up on my hesitation. "Don't stress," he says. "Just tell us what happened. Nobody's gonna know, it stays between us." And suddenly I felt calmer for some reason. I didn't go into details. I said that after reporting to the KDP that nobody was at the far node, it seemed to me that I saw the major. But when I came closer, there was no one there. That's when I got spooked. Like I was alone, deep underground, dark all around. And there's a whole kilometer of dark tunnel to walk before you reach any place with people. My nerves just didn't handle it. Honestly, I didn't lie about a single thing. I just didn't tell them that I thought I saw the major fall into the shaft. The duty guys exchanged looks. The captain shoved a mug of tea into my hands, told me to sit quietly, and he and his assistant went into the break room. They closed the door and talked about something in there for a few minutes. I drank the tea. I couldn't taste anything. It felt like some internal fuse had blown. I'd mostly calmed down, but the shaking wouldn't stop. The mug in my hands rattled non-stop. Then suddenly, I see that on the console, on the duty commutator, a button is blinking. And I'm just staring at that blinking button, and this uneasiness creeps right back into me. The duty guys are mumbling behind the door, and the button keeps blinking. I couldn't take it, got up, and checked where the call was coming from. The call was from the far node. I called the captain. The duty guys burst in. They stared at me. I just nodded at the console. The assistant immediately switched the loudspeaker on. A soft, pleasant static filled the room, with some kind of whistling mixed in. That was weird as hell, because the basement connection was always crystal clear. When we used to sneak over to the comm girls to call home, the sound was like the caller was in the next room. And now there was this static and whistling. The assistant demanded several times that the caller identify themselves, and then suddenly, through the noise and whistles, we heard the words clearly and distinctly, "Don't start it on the triangle." The voice sounded very much like Major Rokotov's. Then the call dropped. The assistant immediately tried contacting the far node through the GGS, but nothing. And I suddenly got scared again, for no reason I could explain. The captain blew up. I'd never seen him like that. He started calling someone, swore nonstop, didn't choose his words at all, promised he'd bury everyone responsible for these jokes. Then he remembered about me and said he was taking me off the shift and I had to go back to the company and keep my mouth shut. I pushed back, really resisted. Because taking a duty tech off his shift is a massive screw-up, and I knew I wasn't guilty of anything. The captain told me not to worry. He'd report upstairs that I was supposedly carrying out special instructions for the duty officer, and that for safety reasons I was entitled to rest. He promised extra leave if I kept quiet and all that crap. Honestly, I'd already realized myself that in my state I wasn't going to be useful on shift anyway. So after my replacement arrived, I went back to the company. The duty officer in the barracks was already in the loop. He just asked if I was alive or not. He also said I wasn't to be woken up until lunch. I thought I wouldn't be able to sleep, but I passed out immediately. Before lunch, the duty officer shook me awake. He told me that in the emergency department, Major Rukotov had died. He fell into the elevator shaft at the far node and was killed. Strangely, at that moment I didn't feel anything special. Maybe I was still half asleep, or maybe everything inside me just burned out. Then our guys from the department came by. They said that in the morning, the major had been talking on the phone with the duty officer, and the conversation had made him laugh a lot. He took the Ifreitor Gritsuk, the same soldier who hadn't been able to fix the mechanism at the far node, and said they would go finish the repairs together. They left the office together, but then Rukotov stopped by the KDP and told Gritsuk to go to the far node and wait there. On the way, Gritsuk ran into some guys from another department. They started chatting and ended up talking for about 5 minutes. It was from these guys that it became clear Rukotov had stayed at the KDP longer, and Gritsuk had gone to the far node alone. About an hour later, a huge stir broke out at the unit. Cops, prosecutors, special officers, commanders of all ranks. Gritsuk was taken out by the unit commander and brought to headquarters. An hour later, they carried out a stretcher covered in OZK cloaks. Then the whole battalion was gathered in the club, and the commander officially informed us of the accident. When asked about Gritsuk, he said he was being treated as a witness for now, and would be isolated until the circumstances were clarified. Then the chief engineer went on at length about safety procedures and so on. Right before lights out, I was called to the duty officer. He told me to check the officer's smoking room. There, waiting for me, were the captain and the proportionic who had just come off shift. Both looked awful. They asked how I was. I said I was fine. We were silent for a moment. Finally, the captain said something like, "Well, so that's how it turned out, calling me by name." He asked me to tell what really happened at the far node that evening. He didn't pressure me, just asked. For some reason, I didn't think to resist, and I told everything as it had happened, or at least as it had appeared to me. I thought it would be hard. No, somehow it came out completely calmly, as if it hadn't happened to me personally, but I was just recounting a story. The duty officers didn't take their eyes off me, they caught every word. When I reached the part where the major fell, I saw their faces turn to stone with fear for the first time. You don't see that in the movies. Normally, nothing much changes in a face, no grimace, no distortion. But just before, their faces had been tense, alive, and then, bam, it went stone cold lifeless. I don't even know how to describe it. I even stopped mid-sentence, so shocked was I by the change. The proportionic was the first to recover. He nodded and told me to continue. The captain just sat there frozen. The sight was eerie, and I tried not to look at him. I finished my story. We sat in silence for a while, smoking. Then proportionic asked what to do next. The captain smirked crookedly and said there was nothing to be done here. Proportionic nodded toward me and asked how to handle me. The captain said he could tell me if I wanted, and if I wanted to know. Then he left. The proportionic asked if I wanted to know what had happened to Major Rokotov. I distinctly remember for some reason I really didn't want him to tell me, but I nodded anyway, and proportionic told me this. In the morning, the duty officer spoke with Rokotov and carefully told him about the events of the previous evening, which greatly amused the major. Rokotov didn't take it seriously at all, and in the end they even argued a bit. The captain strictly forbade the major from going to the far node alone and demanded that all work be officially logged. Surprised, the major sent Gritsuk to the far node, while he himself stopped by the KDP on the way, where he had a detailed conversation with the captain. By the end of it, Rokotov had stopped smiling. Two things particularly struck him. First, the set of probes mentioned in the penultimate call from the far node was Rokotov's personal tool. He had only brought it yesterday, took it with him to the far node, and then left it in his desk, deliberately buried in paper so that no one would steal it. In other words, nobody could have known that Rokotov's desk contained the probe set, especially not the prankster calling from the far node. Second, the phrase, "don't start it on the triangle," we heard in the final call from the far node had a specific meaning. The malfunction Rokotov was dealing with at the far node only manifested when the motor windings were switched to a triangle configuration. But Rokotov hadn't told anyone about this, not even me. The duty officer briefly suspected me, but I had a very good personal relationship with the major. I had even visited him at his home in Solentsevo during leave, and he defended me. He promised he would come by the barracks in the evening to talk with me. That settled it, and Rokotov went to the far node, where Ifreitor Gritsuk was already waiting for him. About 20 minutes later, Gritsuk called from the far node and reported that Major Rokotov had just fallen into the elevator shaft at the far node right before his eyes. He asked for help and instructions. The captain ordered them not to do anything, not to approach the shaft, to stay by the phone, and to wait for the rescue team. A few minutes later, the rescuers, led by the duty officer, arrived at the shaft in a trolley and opened the locked shaft doors. They indeed found Major Rokotov's body on the floor. His arms twisted, legs bent, and a shattered skull clearly showed he had fallen from above. Upstairs, they found Ifreitor Griciuk barely conscious, still clutching the phone in his hand. The captain forbade touching anything and immediately sent the rescuers back with the trolley, contacted his assistant, and ordered updates to be sent up the chain. He then instructed Griciuk to recount everything exactly as it had happened. Griciuk explained that he had arrived about 10 minutes before Rokotov and, after waiting a bit, had decided to step around the corner for a smoke so the major wouldn't smell it when he arrived. Just as he was taking his last drag, he heard the creak of the moving shaft barrier. He quickly stubbed out the cigarette and went to the shaft. Coming around the corner, he saw the major standing with his back to him, right at the edge of the open shaft. Griciuk wanted to call out to him, but was afraid the major might fall from surprise. He said that at that moment it seemed to him that someone had called the major from behind. The major even turned but saw no one. When Griciuk looked again, the major was facing him, staring past him, smiling. Then the major slowly raised his hands, as if on command, and slowly fell backward into the shaft. Griciuk ran to the phone, reported the incident to the KDP, and didn't leave the phone until the duty officer arrived. I listened to that story almost indifferently, without any particular emotion. Maybe my mind was already incapable of reacting to that kind of freaky shit. Or maybe I just knew what I was about to hear. I said a quick goodbye to the propor and went back to the barracks. The investigation didn't take long. The examination determined that at the moment of hitting the shaft floor, Rokotov had been alive. They found no signs of other injuries, no traces of alcohol or drugs. No motives for suicide were found either, and everything was officially recorded as an accident. Griciuk was listed as a witness, but he never appeared at the unit again. What happened to him after that, I don't know. Of course, a lot of heads rolled. They fired the department chief and removed the unit commander. The duty officer and his assistant received reprimands, though it wasn't really their fault because the day's work had been properly documented and registered. But neither of them went on duty again. The captain resigned shortly afterward and the propor transferred to Chekhov. I recovered fairly quickly. I was young, and my psyche was still solid. At first there was some apathy that kept me from thinking too much about what had happened. Later I had different thoughts, but even that passed. I never stopped going on shifts, the basement didn't scare me, and I went to the far node many times, often alone, and never felt anything frightening. While the captain and propor were still at the unit, they tried to bring up the topic with me, but I avoided it, and they quickly gave up. I'm a simple guy. Spending too much time worrying about weird shit isn't my style. Like they said in the army, the day passed, and fuck it. Then came Demble, home sweet home, my girl, a wedding. A son was born, life went on normally. I had tried not to lose touch with my army friends, especially since many were from Donbass. Sometimes I visited them, sometimes they came to me. Many years passed since then. And then, one day, I called a friend in Luhansk, and there was this strange noise on the line. I didn't immediately realize why it sounded familiar, but inside I felt this weird knot in my stomach. Calm noise, even kind of pleasant with whistles, like a jerboa whistling. And suddenly, I got scared. I hung up, called back, and the same noise was there again. I tried other numbers in Luhansk, Mariupol, Kiev, all fine. Either they answered, or there were normal rings and static. But when I called that friend, the same happy whistling noise came through. Then I remembered the KDP, the call from the far node, and that strange whistling. It gave me a bad feeling. I finally got through to my friend and asked how he was. He was cheerful, said everything was fine. He was going to his nephew's wedding the next day. Don't know what came over me, but I tried to dissuade him. My friend freaked out, said I'd lost it. And what was I supposed to tell him, that the noise on the phone freaked me out? Anyway, my friend got stabbed at the wedding and died the next day. That's why I don't like talking on the phone anymore. I stick to SMS now.